It's a massive bottleneck where giant oil tankers are squeezed into just two tight shipping lanes, one for ships going in and one for ships coming out.
This is the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. And right now it is closed. On March 31st, 2026, an Iranian drone struck a Kuwaiti supertanker anchored in the port of Dubai.
Drone attacks from Iran. Kuwait state-owned oil company said a fire broke out on a Kuwaiti-flagged oil tanker in Dubai's port.
No warning. Full crew on board. That same day, 3 container ships were turned back at the mouth of the strait at gunpoint. 20 million barrels of oil a day suddenly had nowhere to go. Except it did. 45 years ago, Saudi Arabia built a 1,200-kilometer pipeline straight across the Arabian Peninsula, through the desert, over mountain ridges rising more than 1,000 feet above sea level, all the way to the Red Sea on the other side. On March 11, 2026, they turned it on at full capacity for the first time in its history. This is how they built it, why it almost never worked, and whether Iran can stop it before it saves the global oil supply. To understand what Saudi Arabia just pulled off, you first have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, and more importantly, what it means when it stops working. It is the only route from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. There is no other way out. Every barrel of oil leaving Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, and the UAE has to squeeze through that single passage, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with 2 unidirectional lanes, one for ships going in, one for ships coming out. Through those 2 lanes flows around 20 million barrels of oil per day. That is roughly 20% of everything the world consumes. Think about that for a moment. One passage, 21 miles wide, and through it flows 1/5 of everything the world burns every single day. In 2024, roughly 84% of crude oil shipments through the strait were destined for Asian markets. China receives about 1/3 of its entire oil supply through that waterway. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through the same route. For decades, energy analysts warned that a closure of the Strait of Hormuz would be catastrophic. Iran had threatened it many times, and every time nothing happened. The world kept moving, the tankers kept flowing, and most people quietly stopped worrying about it. Then, on February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran under Operation Epic Fury. And Tehran, in retaliation, began targeting ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz, effectively closing the waterway to non-Iranian vessels almost overnight. The thing everyone said would never happen had happened. Here is something that almost nobody outside the energy world knew before this crisis began. Saudi Arabia had been preparing for this exact moment since 1979. That year, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah and sent a clear signal to Riyadh. The Persian Gulf was no longer a safe place to depend on for your entire export economy. King Khalid authorized construction of an overland alternative in 1979. 2 years later, with the Iran-Iraq War already raging, the first oil began flowing through what would become one of the most strategically significant pieces of infrastructure ever built. The tanker war, a maritime phase of the Iran-Iraq War, ran from 1981 to 1988. According to Britannica and the U.S. Naval Institute, it was the most sustained attack on merchant shipping since the Second World War. Both sides attacked oil tankers and cargo ships in the Persian Gulf, killing over 400 sailors and damaging hundreds of vessels. Iraq struck ships serving Iranian ports. Iran hit back at ships serving Iraq's Gulf Arab backers, including Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Ships were burning in the waters Saudi Arabia depended on for its survival, and Riyadh watched all of it and made a decision: build a way out. The 1,200-kilometer dual-pipe system connects the Abqaiq oil processing complex in the eastern province to the Red Sea export terminal at Yanbu, running 48-inch and 56-inch steel lines across the Arabian Peninsula. 2 pipes, buried in the desert. crossing terrain so hostile that engineering it required solutions no pipeline had attempted at that scale before. According to the House of Saud Research Archive and confirmed by engineering records cited in the Engineering News Record, the original construction required laying steel pipe across 1,200 kilometers of desert, including sections crossing the Dana Sand Sea and the Hejaz mountain range, climbing to over 1,000 meters above sea level before descending to the western coast. Ships over the mountains. That is what the title promises. And that is exactly what this pipe delivers. Not ships made of steel and cargo, but the oil that fills them, pulled from the ground in eastern Saudi Arabia, pushed through two enormous steel tubes across the full width of the Arabian Peninsula, and poured into supertankers waiting on the Red Sea. A newsletter called the Mid-East Report, published in December 1980, heralded the planned pipeline, describing it as an alternative to the strategic yet vulnerable Strait of Hormuz, which could eventually come under Iranian guns. That was written over 40 years before this crisis. The people who wrote it were right, and Saudi Arabia was listening. Before you can understand the pipeline, you have to understand where it starts. The Abqaiq oil processing facility, located approximately 60 kilometers southwest of Dhahran in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, is the world's biggest oil processing and crude stabilization plant. It has the capacity to process up to 7 million barrels of crude oil a day, more than half of Saudi Arabia's total crude production capacity and approximately 7% of the global oil supply. 7% of everything the entire world produces, processed through a single facility in the Saudi desert. The facility is the main processing hub for Arabian light and Arabian extra-light crude oils. It receives crude from major oil fields in the eastern province, primarily the Ghawar field, strips out impurities like hydrogen sulfide and sand, and sends stabilized crude west through the pipeline or east to refineries on the Gulf Coast. That Ghawar field deserves a moment of its own. Ghawar is by far the largest conventional oil field in the world. It stretches roughly 280 kilometers long and 30 kilometers wide. It has been producing since 1951. According to NS Energy and the Canadian Society of Exploration Geophysicists, it reached a peak of 5.7 million barrels per day in 1981, the highest sustained production rate achieved by any single oil field in world history. This is the reservoir that feeds Abqaiq, and Abqaiq is where the pipeline begins. The Petroline has 13 pumping stations along its route, pushing crude oil from east to west across the full width of the Arabian Peninsula at standard flow rates of between 3 and 8 miles per hour. That means it takes roughly 4 to 10 days for oil pumped into the pipeline at Abqaiq to appear as a loaded cargo on a supertanker at Yanbu. The scale of the whole system is almost impossible to hold in your head at once. The world's largest oil field, the world's largest oil processing plant, a 1,200-kilometer pipe over a mountain range, and a Red Sea port that most of the world had never heard of until this crisis began. Within hours of the crisis escalating, Saudi Aramco began rerouting crude shipments through the pipeline, diverting flows away from the Gulf and toward Yanbu. Aramco began contacting customers as soon as war broke out, asking if they would divert their vessels to Yanbu with Hormuz now impassable. Saudi tanker giant Bahri began making similar requests of shipowners. By March 4th, Aramco confirmed it had begun ramping up operations on the pipeline. Within days, a major Indian refiner snapped up cargoes from Yanbu, the first sign the workaround was gaining traction. According to Reuters, that tanker arrived in India after transiting the Red Sea, the first confirmed delivery of Saudi crude via the bypass route since the crisis began. Then the numbers began moving in ways that stunned the energy market. In January 2026, Yanbu loaded an average of 1.3 million barrels per day. In February, before the war, loadings ran at roughly 1.1 million barrels daily. In the first 9 days of March, tanker tracking firm Claire found Yanbu averaged 2.2 million barrels per day, a jump of more than 100% in under 2 weeks. But the pipeline still was not at full capacity. To get there, Aramco had to do something it had never done before at a sustained scale. In 2019, following Houthi drone strikes on Aramco's Abqaiq facility, the company converted parallel natural gas liquids lines to carry crude oil, raising emergency capacity to 7 million barrels per day. That figure had never been tested at sustained flows until now. On March 10th, Saudi Aramco CEO Amin Nasser announced the company was ramping Petroleum to full capacity, telling investors it would hit that mark in the next couple of days. The conversion was completed on March 11th, confirmed by S&P Global Commodity Insights. A flotilla of at least 25 supertankers headed to Saudi Arabia's Red Sea port of Yanbu, giving the kingdom the capacity to ship approximately 50 million barrels of oil from the port, according to ship tracking data compiled by Bloomberg.
So breaking news coming in now, Saudi Arabia's crucial east-west pipeline. Now this is the east-west pipeline which circumvents the Strait of Hormuz, is pumping oil at its full capacity of 7 million barrels a day. According to a person familiar with the matter, crude exports via Yanbu have now reached about 5 billion barrels a day, and the kingdom is also exporting 7 lakhs to 9 lakhs barrels a day of refined products, according to our sources.
The pipe that the world forgot existed had become, overnight, the most important piece of energy infrastructure on the planet. Here is something most people covering this crisis missed entirely. This was not the first time someone tried to shut that pipeline down. In May of 2019, Houthi drones struck 2 oil pumping stations on the east-west pipeline, more than 200 miles from Riyadh. Saudi Arabia paused oil pumping through the pipeline in response. According to Al Jazeera and the U.S.-Iran primer published by the U.S. Institute of Peace, the drones flew hundreds of kilometers from Yemen into the heart of Saudi Arabia, hitting the pipeline at 2 points before being identified. 7 drones. They flew deep into Saudi Arabia. They hit pumping stations on the exact pipeline now carrying the global oil supply. The pipeline shut down temporarily, and then it reopened. The attack alarmed analysts. A slow, low-flying aircraft had penetrated Saudi airspace for several hours without being intercepted. If drones that basic could reach that far, what could more advanced weapons do? The answer came in September 2019. Drones and cruise missiles struck the Abqaiq processing facility, the largest crude oil stabilization plant in the world, cutting Saudi Arabia's oil output by approximately half, wiping out around 5% of global production in a single strike. The fires at Abqaiq were visible from space. Production was partially restored within 48 hours, but the attack had exposed something the world had not fully reckoned with. Saudi Arabia's entire energy export system ran through a handful of facilities that a determined adversary with cheap drones could reach. That attack taught Aramco something critical. The bypass was vulnerable, so they upgraded it. They converted the natural gas liquids pipelines to handle crude. They raised emergency capacity to 7 million barrels per day. They hardened the pumping stations. They war-gamed every failure scenario they could think of. And then in 2026, the war everyone had been preparing for finally arrived. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry confirmed on March 20th that an Iranian drone struck near the Samref refinery in Yanbu, a facility processing around 400,000 barrels per day, prompting a temporary halt to exports from the terminal. The backup plan had already been attacked. Once in 2019, once in 2026. Both times it survived. Both times it restarted. But the attacks revealed something that energy analysts had been quietly worried about for years. Pipelines and pumping stations are static, high-value targets. You cannot hide a 1,200-kilometer pipe in the desert, and the people who want to shut it down know exactly where every pumping station is. Here is the arithmetic that no one in the Saudi government wants to say out loud. The Strait of Hormuz normally carries around 20 million barrels per day of petroleum liquids. roughly 1/5 of everything the world consumes. The Petroline, running at absolute maximum wartime capacity, can move 7 million barrels a day through the pipe. But the port at Yanbu can only physically load a fraction of that. The port's two terminals, Yanbu North and Yanbu South, have a combined nominal loading capacity of roughly 4.5 million barrels per day. Market sources quoted by Argus Media put the effective, operationally tested figure closer to 4 million. Energy consultancy Vortexa estimated the terminals could handle roughly 3 million barrels per day under current wartime conditions, so the pipe can carry 7 million. The port can load 3 to 4 million, and the strait normally moves 20 million. Shifting oil exports from Gulf terminals to Yanbu has helped Saudi Arabia maintain about 70% of its normal export levels, while turning its Red Sea terminals into some of the busiest in the world. But 70% of Saudi Arabia's exports is not 20% of global oil supply. The rest, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, the UAE, has nowhere to go. According to Argus Media, Saudi Arabia cut production by around 2.5 million barrels per day, shutting in several offshore fields including Safaniya, Marjan, Zuluf, and Abu Safa in response to Iranian missile and drone threats targeting Gulf energy infrastructure. The IEA confirmed on March 12, 2026, that the world is currently experiencing the largest disruption in energy supply in history, surpassing even the crises of the 1970s. Oil prices have soared as a result, with Brent crude surging more than 50% in March and briefly topping $116 to $119 per barrel as markets reacted to the ongoing war and the historic supply shock. The pipeline is not a solution. It is a pressure valve, and the pressure it is releasing is only a fraction of what is building up. Saudi Arabia did not escape danger when it activated the Petroline. It moved the danger somewhere else, because once oil loads at Yanbu, it still has to get somewhere. And to reach Asia, which is where most of it goes, those supertankers have to pass through another strait, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Its name literally means Gate of Tears in Arabic, after its famously treacherous sailing conditions. Situated between Yemen on the Arabian Peninsula and Eritrea and Djibouti in Africa, it connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean beyond. According to Fortune and the U.S. Energy Information Administration, an oil tanker leaving Saudi Arabia heading for the Netherlands only has to travel 12,000 kilometers if it goes via the Red Sea, compared with more than 20,000 kilometers going south around Africa. And here is the problem. The Houthis, the Iranian-backed armed group controlling large parts of Yemen, sit directly overlooking that strait. They have anti-ship ballistic missiles with a range of 200 kilometers. They have drones. They have cruise missiles. And they have already proven between 2023 and 2025 that they are willing to use all of them against commercial shipping. According to Foreign Policy, greater Houthi involvement, and especially any threat to the Bab el-Mandeb, is so worrisome because that strait has been the one outlet untouched by Iran's otherwise solid chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz. Since the start of the latest Iran war, Saudi Arabia has rerouted close to 5 million barrels a day across the peninsula to oil terminals on the Red Sea. If the Houthis go all in, virtually no more tankers will reach Asian economies already struggling with an energy crisis. According to Kepler, if the Houthis were to disrupt traffic through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, shipping vessels that reroute via the Suez Canal and then around the Cape of Good Hope to deliver Saudi crude to Asia would face a voyage of nearly 50 days, more than double the current transit time, effectively stranding crude that Asia desperately needs. Saudi Arabia built a bypass around one trap, and the bypass runs directly through another one. Mohammed Mansour, Deputy Information Minister in the Houthi government, told CNN directly that closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is a viable option. As of the end of March 2026, the Houthis have already entered the conflict, firing missiles at Israel. Analysts quoted by Al Jazeera warned that their most significant move would be blocking the Bab el-Mandeb with boats, mines, or missiles. All they have to do, one analyst said, is fire at a couple of ships coming through. That alone would lead to the halt of all commercial shipping through the Red Sea. This is the scenario that keeps energy economists awake at night. A combined Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb disruption would block approximately 30% of global container shipping from normal routing and threaten roughly 22% of global oil supply. The East-West pipeline loses its strategic value for the Asian market entirely if the Bab el-Mandeb closes. Roughly 84% of all Gulf crude oil is destined for Asia. Oil arriving at Yanbu via Petroline must travel south through the Bab el-Mandeb to reach Asia. If that route closes, the oil can only go north to Europe, which cannot absorb the entirety of Asian demand, nor can the Suez Canal handle the massive vessel sizes efficiently. The pipe would still work, the oil would still move, but the customers at the end of the journey could no longer receive it. Japan, South Korea, India, China, countries that collectively depend on Gulf crude for a substantial share of their energy needs, would face a supply crunch with no viable solution. 50 days. In a world where oil storage is already filling up and refineries are running on thinning margins, 50 days is not a delay. It is a crisis with consequences that ripple from energy prices into food prices, into manufacturing costs, into the kind of inflation that has already destabilized governments before. Let's step back from the immediate crisis for a moment. In 1979, Saudi Arabia spent the equivalent of $8.5 billion in today's money to build a pipe through a desert and over a mountain range that most of the world would never see. They did it not because they needed it then. They did it because they understood they might need it later. For 4 decades, that pipeline sat mostly idle. According to the Engineering News record, Gulf oil producers made a calculated bet for 40 years. Any Hormuz closure would be short-lived, and partial bypass capacity was enough insurance. The bet was correct in one sense and incomplete in another. Correct because the pipeline worked. Incomplete because the planners of 1981 never anticipated the bypass itself would become a target. From the same Iranian-backed forces, the bypass was built to escape. According to ENET News, discussions are already underway to rehabilitate the pipeline linking Saudi Arabia to Sidon, shut down in 1990. Iraq has hinted at a new pipeline to Aqaba. The map of global energy is being redrawn in real time. The pipe is still running. As of April 2026, nobody knows for how much longer. What we do know is this. A king made a decision in 1979. He looked at tankers burning in the Persian Gulf and built a way out through the desert before anyone told him he would need one. 45 years later, that decision is the only thing standing between a functioning global oil supply and a complete collapse of the routes that move it. The same revolution that made the pipe necessary is now the force testing it. And somewhere in the mountains above the Gate of Tears, men with drones and missiles are watching supertankers loaded with Saudi crude sail south through the one waterway the pipe cannot bypass. They have no oil of their own to protect, no economy that depends on those waters staying open, no reason to hold back except the calculation that the right moment has not yet arrived. The ice is giving back what it kept. The pipe is holding what was built into it. Whether the gate stays open is not an engineering question. It never was.